Hello, my dears. Thank you so much for joining me again today. Now, if you saw from my tweets that I sent out, today we will be going over the buka. And I will go ahead and start as I do have a meeting that I need to get to in about an hour. So, or a little bit over an hour. So we have just enough time for our reading session for today. So, without much further ado, we shall begin our readings of the buka. And as I always say, if there is any issue with the audio, please let me know. So we will first begin with a small sector, kind of going over just what the buka is. The buka, or puka, seems essentially an animal spirit. Some derive his name from Hawk, a he-goat, and speculative persons consider him the forefather of Shakespeare's Puck. On solitary mountains and among old ruins he lives, grown monstrous with much solitude, and is of the race of the nightmare. In the MS story called Macna Micum Harlow, of uncertain authorship, writes me, Mr. Douglas Hyde. We read that out of a certain hill in Leinster, there used to emerge as far as his middle a plump, sleek, terrible steed, and speak in human voice to each person about November Day. And he was accustomed to give intelligent and proper answers to such as consulted him concerning all that would befall them until the November of next year. And the people used to leave gifts and presents at the hill until the coming of Patrick and the holy clergy. This tradition appears to be a conne, one with that of the buka. Yes, unless it were merely a usage or water horse, for these, we are told, were common once, and used to come out of the water to gallop on the sands and in the fields, and people would often go between them in the marge and bridle them, and they would make the finest of horses, if only you could keep them away from the sight of water. But if they once saw a glimpse of the water, they would plunge in with their rider and tear him to pieces at the bottom. Quite similar to some of the bits of a Kelpie. It being a November spirit, however, tells in favor of the Buka, for November Day is sacred to the Buka. It is hard to realize that wild staring phantom grown sleek and civil. He has many shapes, is now a horse, now a donkey, now a bull, now a goat, now an eagle. Like all spirits, he is only half in the world of form. Our first little segment seems to be a bit of a going over just what the Buka is. A little bit more separate than the little opening segment. But this first bit is called the Buka, attributed to someone simply titled EW. And underneath the attributations of it, there is a small little quote. Goblins haunt from fire or fern, or mine or flood, to the walks of men, and it's attributed to someone by the name of Collins. Now that schoolmaster is abroad, there can be no question that the warm sun of education will, in the course of a very few years, dissipate those vapors of superstition, whose wild and shadowy forms have from time immemorial thrown a mysterious mantle around our mountain summits, shed a darker horror through our deepest glens, traced some legendary tale on each unchiseled column of stone that rises on our bleakest hills, and peopled the green border of the wizard stream, and sainted well with beings of a spiritual world. While, however, the Friends of Ireland cannot be but pleased in thinking that our peasantry should, from being better informed, renounce their belief in these idle tales of superstition, to which they, unfortunately, have for centuries been taught to listen with delight, to the exclusion of mortals, of matters more rational and more important. It is to be hoped that the two prominent features of our antiquity as a nation will not be altogether lost sight of, namely, our vernacular language and those extraordinary legends which are esteemed by many as going a great length to prove, from their remarkable analogy with the tales of the Eastern world, our Oriental descent. Although the good people can still retain a most respectable footing, a peasant may now travel from Cape Cod to Connemara without encountering that once dreaded personages, a ghost. Even the puka, or some might say an Irish goblin, has not for the last 40 years, as far as our recollection serves, been known to shake the dripping ooze from his hairy hide, to approach the haunts of men, and to practice by the conscious light of the moon, like the fairies and satyrs of heathen mythology. Any of those unlucky tricks upon his mortal neighbors, for which he was at one period so much dreaded in many portions of our island. The puka is described as a frisky, mischievous being, having such a turn for roguish fun as to induce him to be all night in wait for a kara returning over the moor from the pleasures of the card table, or for the frequenter of wakes. His usual appearance was that of a sturdy pony with a shaggy hide. He generally lay crouched like a cat in the pathway of the unfortunate pedestrian. Then, starting between his legs, he hoisted the unlucky wretch aloft on his cupper, from which no shin-breaking rushings by stone walls, no furious diving through white thorn hedges, or life-shaking plunges down cliff and quagmire could unseat him. The first crowing of the March cock respited the sorrowful rider, who generally ended this dear-bought tour by a tremendous fling from the puka's back into some deep bog hole or thorny brake, where 10,000 prickles reared their points to drink the blood of his bruised and broken flesh. On the other hand, he is reported to commiserate the lot of the benighted traveler. And there are some instances on record of his having gently trotted beneath the wayfaring cottager for many a mile to the neighborhood of the well-remembered cabin on the hearth. Puka, in a country of Kerry, in the county of Kerry, was, as the name imports, the haunt of one of these imaginary monsters. This fee, or marsh, belonged to Tim Durney, a snug farmer, whose ancestors for many years occupied the adjacent farm, and who, honest men in that golden age, never found it necessary to disturb the goblin in its favorite haunts by reclaiming his dreary abode. But when the farm of his grandfather tilled came into Tim Dorney's occupation, a taste for improvement and the necessary expenditure of a large and increasing family induced him to cross-cut Puka by drains and ditches. And 2 summers had hardly passed when this haunt of the wild goose and the dark, mischievous goblin afforded a heavy swarm of hay and firm footing for man and beast. The pooka, thus beaten up and driven from the marsh, naturally turned his thoughts to the meditation of revenge on him who, with profane hand, rent asunder that sacred veil which the superstition of ages had woven round the dreaded spot. Tim was a painstaking, industrious peasant, and accustomed to traverse his farm every night to ascertain that no neighboring cattle trespassed on his ground. One night he returned along the border of the marsh. He saw something shaped like a dark-colored, long-tailed pony lie in the marrowway, directly across his path, and before he could slip aside to shun the lurking apparition, the pooka, for it was he, suddenly started between the legs of the terrified farmer and bore him off the ground. The goblin rushed along with the speed of the whirlwind, and Tim's first moment of reflection was employed in a fruitless attempt to fling himself to the ground. But he found that some invisible hand had bound him to the back of his supernatural enemy. It would be tedious to recount the hard rubbings against stone walls and the wild rushings through quickset hedges that Tim Durney endured, while the rapidity of his flight completely deprived him of breath and utterance. At last they rushed towards a tall cliff which frowned in horrid gloom above a deep river, and intercepted by its giant bulk the yellow light of the moon that lit the mountain tops, quivered in the rustling foliage of the trees, and brightening in its abundance, furnished the trembling waters with liquid fire. The pooka pushed with unabated speed to the edge of the rock, then suddenly stopped, as if to add to the death pang of his agonized victim by a previous view of the fearful height and the dark waves that curled among the pointed rocks below. Tim Durney now concluded that all of his life would be ended for him in the next plunge, yelled a shriek of unutterable dismay. The tall cliff returned the piercing sound with which the scream of the startled wildfowl and the deepened voice of the pooka, that combined with the mockery of human laughter with a wild, indescribable howl, blended in horrid unison along the lonely glen. Whether the pooka was satisfied with thus inflicting the pangs of a frightful death by anticipation, or that he possessed no power over human life, does not appear, but in the next moment he started from the fearful cliff and returned through the deep ravines and tangled underwood to a furze brake that skirted the border of a standing pool, plunged his unfortunate rider among the sharp rushes. Happy in his deliverance, he heard the troubled waters of the dark pool resound to the plunge of the returning pooka. beheld his uncouth figure glance darkly along the moor, till the lessening form grew dimly faint in the moonlight, and the hurried splashing of his rapid hoof broke the silence of the night no more. Tim, as may naturally be supposed, made the best of his way to the cottage, and being of true Milesian origin, determined on having his revenge upon his fiendish enemy. It was a fine night in the month of August when Tim Dorney, having sufficiently recruited himself after his adventure of wild horsemanship, walked forth, like him that hath his quarrel just, doubly armed. His heels were furnished in a pair of long-necked spurs that bore rowels contrived at the next forage, which could goad a rhinoceros to death. His hand wielded a loaden whip, so called from the handle being set with lead, and in the grasp of a strong man was capable of felling an ox. He whistled as he went, not for want of thought, for his mind was brooding over a plan of revenge against the Pooka, who, according to his usual habit, started between the farmer's legs and bore him off. Tim, nothing loath at the abduction, just when the Pooka was commencing his antics, twisted the leash of the whip round his hand and leveled such blows about the goblin's ears that would have crushed any skull made of mortal, penetrable stuff, while the sharp-walled spurs gave ample revenge for the pointed insults of the preceding night. Dire were the tossings, deep the groans of the Pooka during this unmerciful ride, but Tim Dorney clung to him like a monkey, until the Pooka lay down, outmastered by his mortal antagonist. Next night, Tim walked abroad in quest of his acquaintance. He whistled his favorite air of Famahula to lull the suspicions of the latter, who held aloof, quite on his guard, eyeing the other from his lurking place, and breaking his usual taciturnity by asking, in an uncouth voice, the well-remembered question, "Arwilna gran uth?" or "Have you sharp things on?" Some years now rolled their seasons round, and the Pooka seemed to have entirely forgotten his antagonist and his ancient dwellings of the marsh, when Tim Dorney had occasion to visit a gossip sister's cousin's brother-in-law, who had lately come home from an absence 25 years on board of man-of-war. The credit side of the account sheet of the seaman's life was fraught with the copious list of wonders, all his travels history, and a pension of 9 pence a day. On the debtor's side stood the loss of the right arm and closing of his starboard eye, and sundry minor details received in the duty of boarding and cutting out, with occasional tavern scuffles. Tim was highly delighted at the tough yarn of his old acquaintance, heard with gaping wonderment the recital of a battle with the French 74 off the island of Elba, where the relator lost his precious arm, an encounter with a Sallee rover, which they sent down to Old Davy, and a dreadful storm near the island of Malta, of voyages along the coast of Tunis, where the people were all musicianers, by Tripoli, famous for its wrestlers, and a journey through the desert of Barca, where the inhabitants, men and women, have dog heads. The ale of a neighboring shebeen greatly improved the sailor's turn for narration, and though the rain poured in torrents through the grass-grown roof of the cabin, yet the night flew on with songs a-clatter, and aye the ale was growing better. But Tim, being retained that night to form one of the party that had engaged to play at cards for 200 of herrings, and as he was a famous curro, he would not disappoint his friends, who mainly depended on Tim's address to carry off the wager. The rain had now ceased, and after grasping the sailor's hands and requesting his company on a given night at Faepuka, he departed. The moon, yet obscured by heavy mountains, cast a sad, sickly gleam along his path, which, winding round the precipice descent, led into the bosom of a deep glen, where the turbid mountain torrents had swelled into muddy waves the clear and beautiful brook that erewhile had bubbled with soothing murmurs along the yellow pebbles. There was no sound on the hill save the plaintive howl of the watchdog, baying the broad round moon. The night wind lightly shook the thin foliage of the decaying wood that surmounted the steep sides of the glen, and the hoarse, hollow sound of the roaring river, that which seemed to a fanciful ear the boding voice of the water fairy, echoed along the distant banks. Though Tim Gurney's education had taught him to people the loneliest scenes with beings of another life, yet he passed unappalled to the brink of the torrent, and sighed to behold that the force of the stream left him little chance of crossing over safely. While he loitered along the bank, he was agreeably surprised to behold, in a little cove which led to the ford, a small horse resembling a Kerry pony. He was tied by a halter at a pulintusa or straw saddle on his back, and into one of the foldings of the straw saddle was stuck a whitethorn plant. Tim, grateful for this favorable opportunity of moving homeward, had already his leg raised to mount, when the titter of suppressed laughter behind the crag shook his heart with terror and excited his suspicion of the pony. He He had not meddled with the whitethorn stick, for he rarely went abroad and by day or night, unprovided with a choice hazel sapling. This miraculous plant, against which nothing evil can contend, well served this time of need. For, retiring a little, Tim Durney bestowed so heartily a salute on the goyful Pooka, for it was he, that the laughter sounds were changed into a wild howl, and as the Pooka disappeared along the troubled stream, the dashing waters deluged the sounding banks. But a time arrived when the persevering goblin weakened cruel revenge on his hitherto fortunate adversary. It was approaching the 25th of March, when the farmers usually pay rent, and Tim, who was extremely punctual in the payment of the half-year's gale, prepared to send a quantity of last season's butter to Cork for that purpose. Wheel carriages were then totally unknown in that part of the country. The sliding car, indebted to no wheels, glided in the vicinity of the farms, while burdens were conveyed to more remote places on the backs of horses. 5 or 6 neighbors at this time were setting off to transmit the produce of the dairy to Cork, and Tim, with 4 stunted nags that usually ran wild and free in the mountains, fell into their company. Each little horse was generally laden with 2 full bounds of butter, but 1 or 2, whose owners were unable to furnish the even number of firkins, carried a large stone placed on the opposite side of the balance to balance the single one. After journeying all night, on the next morning the accident happened to Tim Durney in his way through Mill Street that seemed the type and forerunner of the evening's misfortune. As the Kerry dragoons marched in long procession through the single street that composes the little town, the drummer of the company of soldiers stationed in his barrack beat the doubling drum with such furious heat as set all the ponies prancing beneath their riders in butter firkins. It happened that the nag on which Tim rode, by an unfortunate curvet on the slippery pavement, had his heels tripped up, and he fell under the load that lumbered on his back. The rider, whose Milistrin irascibility was not much allayed at having the ace dint perpetrated by a red coat, drew his trusty hazel from its resting place between the firkins, and by its instantaneous application to the drummer's head forced him to bite the dust. Though the drummer, for certain striking reasons, was no favorable with his comrades, yet a sentinel who had witnessed this insult to the cloth leveled him with the butt end of his piece. The alarm being given, the soldiers rushed thick and fast to assault the Kerry dragoons, and as quick rushed the townfolk to their support. The reader's imagination must supply what I would fail in delineating. It will suffice to tell that after some broken heads and bayonet thrusts on both sides, the redcoats retreated to their stronghold, and the triumphant Carrionians were escorted by their faithful allies to the summit of Mersha Mountain. In the evening, the caravan came within view of Blarney Castle, while the last rays of the declining sun tinged its ivy turrets with a golden hue. As the night breeze blew keen and fierce, our travelers halted at a small public house on the road to repel its chilling influence by a glass of spirits. Their delay was hardly for a minute, and they hastened to overtake the horses that moved at a small, slow pace before them. But suddenly some strange disorder began to prevail among the animals. Some fled terrified along the road. Others ran across the open common that extended to the right, and Tim Durney's train, particularly, were observed to reach a fearful and perpendicular descent, from whose edge the road lay about 20 yards. Their terrified owner uttered a shriek of dread and despair when he beheld the misshapen Aripuka urge his cattle to by the steep cliff. It was only the work of a moment. They rushed as if by an irresponsible impulse to the fatal brink, and tumbling headlong, one instant beheld their shattered lifeless carcasses strew the bottom of the stream-worn ravine. The pointed rocks below staved the butter casks to pieces, and their contents were wholly lost. This was but commencement of the train of misfortune to Tim Durney. He was finally ejected from his snug, well-improved farm. Veapuka, that had been in the occupation of his family for 150 years before, passed into the hands of strangers, and the descendants of Tim Durney are homeless wanderers on the earth, and such is the account which at this day is given by the remaining members of the family of the commencement of their misfortune. Hydration break. Our next story is The Puka of Baltracy, attributed to Patrick Kennedy. Young Pat Davison of this townland was sent by his grandmother for a pitcher of water about 1 o'clock in the afternoon, but it was not till sunset that the truant, whose absence had caused quite disquietude in the interim, was seen coming from the meadow from the side of the wood where the well lay. He seemed much fatigued, with various rents were visible in his clothes and scratches on his naked legs. His overjoyed grandmother went down the path to meet him, but she took good care to dissemble her feelings. She looked at him with lowering brows, winding the strings of her apron, and the while round the useful article, presently to the duty of a whip. "You villain of the world," was her first greeting. "What kept you till now? Where were you loitering?" "Oh, Granny honey, it's well you would never see me again. Look at my clothes and my poor legs." "Why, child, what happened to you?" "Musha, and wasn't it the puka happened to me? The curse of old Cromwell on him, just as I was stooping down at the well to fill the jug. What did I see but his ears and his neck coming out between my legs, and before I had time to bless myself, off he was with me through the wood, knocking my head against the boughs and tearing my legs against the brush till we got through and were out to the fields. Oh, Granny, such splashes as he made over ditches and rivers, and so afraid I was that I'd be thrown every minute. Well, at last, where were we charging but at the house where Aunt Bessie lived, and that the roof is off. You run full plump up to it, and when I was expecting to have my head broken against the wall, there we were through the window, and never crack till we got to Cloncurry. Well, there he put his ugly nose to the ground and kicked up his hind legs, thinking to have me down in less than no time, but I held to the mane like vengeance and gripped his sides with my knees. He turned back there and gave me some ear hauling till we got to the well again, and then he pitched me off like a sack of waste. And Granny honey, isn't it a mercy that you ever see me again? Oh, Musha, my poor child, it's grateful I am that the devil of a puka wasn't allowed to murder you. Come in." The winged words of this story soon went through the townsland, and when Pat presented himself at school the next day, the faithless master began questioning the hero on the peculiars of his ride. The youth, either decomposed by the cold glances of the judge's eyes, or rendered by the terror accompanying the exploit, incapable of exact recollection, was found himself varying from himself in some single particulars, and the result was a severe poisoning. After some time, when the wounds were ceasing to smart, and the master's back was turned, the urchin had the ill nature to jeer at him for telling such a barefaced lie to his grandmother about the puka. "Oh, the Sara puka you," said he. "If you were there and saw Granny looking so vicious and twisting her apron to leather you, you'd invent a worse thing yourself." "Ah, hello, Game Crazy. Thank you for popping in." "Ah, and I see we have a new follower, Rhea Max. Thank you so much for the follow." Our next and potentially Our last story is called The Crooked Back, attributed to T. Crofton Crocker. I did game crazy. It was fun collabing with him yesterday. Peggy Barrett was once tall, well-shaped, and comely. She was in her youth remarkable for two qualities not often found together, for being the most thrifty housewife and the best dancer in her native village, Ballyholly. But she now, upwards of 60 years old, and during the last 10 years of her life, was never able to stand upright. Her back is bent nearly to the level, yet she has the freshest use of all her limbs that could be enjoyed in such a posture. Her health is good, her mind vigorous, and in the family of her eldest son, with whom she has lived with since the death of her husband, she performs all the domestic services which her age and the infirmary just mentioned allow. She washes the potatoes, makes the fire, sweeps the house, labors in which she good-humoredly says that she finds her crooked back mighty convenient, plays with the children, and tells stories to the family and their neighboring friends, who often collect round her son's fireside to hear them during the long winter evenings. Her powers of conversation are highly extolled, both for humor and narration, and anecdotes of droll or awkward incidents connected with the posture in which she has been so long fixed, as well as the history of the occurrence to which she owes the misfortune, are favorite topics of her discourse. Among other matters, she is fond of relating how, on a certain day, at the close of a bad harvest, when several tenants of the estate on which she lived concerned in a field a petition for an abatement of rent, they placed the paper on which they wrote upon her back, which they found no very inconvenient substitute for the table. Peggy, like all experienced storytellers, suited her tales both in length and subject to the audience of the occasion. She knew that in broad daylight, when the sun shines brightly and the trees were budding and the birds were singing around us, when men and women, like ourselves, are moving and speaking, employed variously in business or amusement, she knew, in short, though certainly without much knowing or caring wherefore, that when we are engaged with the realities of life and nature, we want that spirit of credulity, without which tales of the deepest interest will lose their power. At such times Peggy was brief, very particular as to facts, and never dealt in the marvelous. The blazing round the hearth, but round the blazing hearth of a Christmas evening, when infidelity is banished from all companies, at least in low and simple life, as a quality, to say the least of it, out of season, when the winds of dark December whistled bleakly round the walls, and almost through the doors of the little mansion, reminding its inmates that as the world is vexed by elements superior to human power, so it may be visited by beings of superior nature. At such times, Peggy Barrett would give full scope to her memory, or her imagination, or both. And upon one of these occasions, she gave the following circumstantial account of the crookening of her back. It was of all days in the year, the day before May Day, that I went out to the garden to weed the potatoes. I would not have gone out that day, but I was dull in myself and sorrowful, and wanted to be alone. All the boys and girls were laughing and joking in the house, making bowling balls and dressing out ribbons for the mummers next day. I couldn't bear it. 'Twas only at the Easter, that when that passed, and that's 10 years last Easter, I won't forget that time, that I buried my poor man, and I thought how gay and joyful I was many a long year before that. At that, the May Eve before our wedding, when, with Robin by my side, I sat cutting and sewing the ribbons of the bowling ball, I was going to give the boys on the next day, proud to be preferred above all the other girls of the banks of the Blackwater, by the handsomest boy and the best hurler in the village. So I left the house and went to the garden. I stayed there all the day and didn't come home to dinner. I don't know how it was, but somehow I continued on, weeding and thinking sorrowfully enough, and singing over some of the old songs that I sung many a time in the days that are gone, and for them that will never come back to me to hear them. The truth is, I hated to go and sit silent and mournful among the people in the house that were merry and young, and had the best of their days before them. It was late before I thought of returning home, and I did not leave the garden till some time after sunset. The moon was up, and though there wasn't a cloud to be seen, and though a star was winking here or there in the sky, the day wasn't long enough gone to have made it clear moonlight. Still, it shone enough to make everything on one side of the heavens look pale and silvery like, and the thin white mist was just beginning to creep along the fields. On the other side, near where the sun was set, it was more of daylight, and the sky looked angry, red, and fiery through the trees, like as if it was lighted up by a great town burning below. Everything was as silent as a churchyard. Only now and then one could hear far off a dog barking, or a cow lowing after being milked. There wasn't a creature to be seen on the road or in the fields. I wondered at this first, but then remembered it was May Eve, and that many a thing, both good and bad, would be wandering about that night, and that I ought to shun danger as well as others. So I walked on as quick as I could, and soon came to the end of the Diminis wall, where the tree rise high and thick at each side of the road, and almost met at the top My heart misgave me when I got under the shade. There was so much light let down from the opening above that I could see about a stone's throw before me. All of a sudden, I heard a rustling among the branches, and on the side of the road, I saw something like a small black goat, only with two long, wide horns turned out instead of being bent backwards, standing upon its hind legs upon the top of the wall, looking down at me. My breath was stopped, and I couldn't move for near a minute. I couldn't help, somehow, keeping my eyes fixed on it, and it never stirred, but kept looking in the same fixed way down at me. At last I made a rush, and went on, but I didn't go 10 steps when I saw the very same sight on the wall to the left of me, standing in exactly the same manner, 3 or 4 times as high and almost as tall as the tallest man. The horns looked frightful. It gazed upon me as before. My legs shook and my teeth chattered, and I thought I would drop down dead every moment. At last I felt as if I was obliged to go on, and as I went, but it was without feeling how I moved, or whether my legs carried me. Just as I passed the spot that the frightful thing was standing, I heard a noise as if something sprung from the wall, and felt like as if a heavy animal plumped down upon me and held with its forefeet clinging to my shoulder, and the hind ones fixed in my gown that was folded and pinned up behind me. 'Tis a wonder of my life ever since how I bore the shock, but so it was, I neither fell nor even staggered with the weight, but walked on as if the strength of 10 men, though I felt as if I couldn't help moving, and couldn't stand still if I wished. Though I gasped with fear, I knew as well as I do now what I was doing. I tried to cry out, but couldn't. I tried to run, but wasn't able. I tried to look back, but my head and neck were as if they were screwed in a vice. I could barely roll my eyes on each side, and then I could see as clearly and painfully as if it was in broad light of the blessed sun, a black and cloven hoof planted on each of my shoulders. I heard a low breathing in my ear. I felt at every step I took my legs strike back against the feet of the creature that was on my back. Still, I could do nothing but walk straight on. At last I came within sight of the house, and a welcome sight it was to me, for I thought I would be released when I reached it. I soon came close to the door, but it was shut. I looked at the window, and it was shut too, for they were more cautious about May Eve than I was. I saw the light inside through the chinks of the door. I heard them talking and laughing within. I felt myself at 3 yards distance from them, that they would die to save me. And may the Lord save me from ever feeling what I did that night, when I found myself held by what could not be good nor friendly. but without the power to help myself, or to call my friends, or to put out my hand to knock, or even to lift my leg to strike the door and let them know that I was outside. It was as if my hands grew to my sides and my feet were glued to the ground, or had the weight of a rock fixed to them. At last I thought of blessing myself, and my right hand, that would do nothing else, did that for me. Still the weight remained on my back, and all was as before. I blessed myself again. 'Twas still all the same. I gave myself up for loss, but I blessed myself a third time, and no sooner had my hand finished the sign than all at once I felt the burden spring off my back. The door flew open as if a clap of thunder bursted, and I was pitched forward on my forehead, in upon the middle of the floor. When I got up, my back was crooked, and I never stood straight from that night to this blessed hour. There was a pause when Peggy Bear had finished. Those who had heard the story before had listened with a look of half-satiated interest, blended, however, with the expression of a serious and solemn feeling that always attends a tale of supernatural wonders, how often soever told. They moved above their seats out of the posture in which they had remained fixed during the narrative, and sat in an attitude which denotated that their curiosity as to the cause of this strange occurrence had been long since allayed. Those to whom it was before unknown still retained their look and posture of strained attention and anxious but solemn expectation. A grandson of Peggy's, about 9 years old, not the child of the son with whom she lived, had never heard the story before. As it grew in interest, he was observed to cling closer and closer to the old woman's side, and at the close he was gazing steadfastly at her, with his body bent back across her knees and his face turned up to hers, with a look through which a disposition to weep seemed contending with curiosity. After a moment's pause, he could no longer restrain his impatience, and casting her grey locks in one hand, while a tear of dread and wonder was just dropping from his eyelash, he cried, "Granny, what was it?" The old woman smiled, first at the elder part of her audience, and then at her grandson, and patting him on the forehead, she said, "It was the puka." And that, my dears, is where I'm afraid we'll have to call it for today. As I had said before, I do have a meeting in which I need to go to, and the ending of this stream seems to be quite perfectly ending at the right time for me to go to it. So, thank you all so much for joining me today. I really do appreciate it. You could be anywhere in the world, but you chose to be here with me. I do hope that you continue to return to watch and be entranced by the glimmer that I give you. So, until we next meet, my dears, stay safe and be mindful of everything and everyone you interact with. And until next we meet, my dears, ta-ta, and be safe. Thank you so much for watching till the end of the video. If you enjoyed what you saw here today, please feel free to like, subscribe, hit that notification bell, and if you wish, leave a comment down below. On each side of me, there should be other videos from my channel that you may or may not wish to look at. But until then, I hope you have a wonderful rest of your day, and thank you so much for joining me.